A billionaire CEO became a janitor in his own company for 6 months. What he discovered about his daughter left him absolutely destroyed. When Douglas Mitchell walked into the boardroom and revealed who he really was, the truth he exposed changed everything. This is the story of a father who lost his wife, watched his daughter destroy his life's work, and went undercover to discover a truth so devastating it nearly broke him. But what he found wasn't what he expected. And the villain in this story wasn't who anyone thought it was. Before we start the story, leave a comment below and tell us what city you're watching from. We love seeing our Deep Stories community growing all around the world. And at the end of this story, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Let us know what you think. If you believe that family is worth fighting for, that abusers should be exposed, and that sometimes the people destroying our lives need saving, not punishing, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is Douglas Mitchell's journey, a story about a billionaire CEO who became a janitor in his own company for 6 months, and what he discovered about his daughter that left him destroyed. Let's begin. Douglas Mitchell stood in the executive bathroom on the 47th floor of Mitchell Innovations headquarters, staring at his reflection in the mirror and barely recognizing the man looking back at him. He was 58 years old, but the past 3 years had aged him a decade. His dark hair, once thick and only touched with distinguished gray at the temples, was now almost entirely silver. Deep lines bracketed his mouth and creased his forehead, marks of grief and stress that no amount of wealth could erase. His blue eyes, which had once been sharp and confident, now held a weariness that went bone deep. He wore a $15,000 Italian suit, custom-tailored to fit his tall frame perfectly, paired with a silk tie and handmade leather shoes that cost more than most people made in a month. He looked every inch the successful CEO he'd spent 35 years becoming. But as he stared at his reflection, Douglas wasn't thinking about his success, or his wealth, or the billion-dollar company he'd built from nothing. He was thinking about his daughter, and the impossible decision he'd made 3 days ago, and whether he had the courage to go through with what he was about to do. Mitchell Innovations occupied 12 floors of one of San Francisco's most prestigious office towers. Douglas had founded the company 35 years ago in a garage in Palo Alto, starting with nothing but a computer science degree from Stanford, a brilliant idea for enterprise software, and determination that bordered on obsession. He'd built it slowly and carefully, making smart decisions, hiring talented people, treating employees well, and developing products that actually solved real problems for businesses. The company had grown steadily year after year, surviving the dot-com crash, adapting to changing technology, expanding into new markets. Now, Mitchell Innovations employed over 8,000 people worldwide, generated $3 billion in annual revenue, and was considered one of the most innovative and well-managed technology companies in the industry. Douglas had poured everything into building this company. It had been his passion, his purpose, the thing that defined him for most of his adult life. But it had never been the most important thing in his life. That honor had belonged to 2 people, his wife Catherine and their daughter Rebecca. Catherine had been his college sweetheart, the brilliant woman who'd believed in him when Mitchell Innovations was just a crazy dream, who'd supported him through the lean early years, who'd been his partner in every meaningful sense of the word. She'd been beautiful and intelligent and kind, with a wicked sense of humor that could make him laugh even during their darkest moments. They'd built a life together, raised their daughter together, created something meaningful together. Then 3 years ago, Catherine had been diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. The diagnosis had come suddenly, devastatingly, after months of symptoms that doctors had dismissed as nothing serious. By the time they caught it, the cancer had already spread extensively. They'd tried everything. The best doctors, the most aggressive treatments, experimental therapies that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Douglas would have spent every penny he had if it meant saving her. But cancer didn't care about money or love or desperation. Catherine had fought for 18 months with incredible courage, but in the end, the disease had won. She died in their home, in their bed, with Douglas holding her hand and telling her he loved her one last time. Her death had shattered him. For months afterward, Douglas had barely functioned. He'd gone through the motions of running his company, attending meetings and making decisions because people depended on him. But inside he was hollow, numb, going through each day on autopilot. Work had always been important to him, but without Catherine, it felt meaningless. She'd been the reason he worked so hard, the person he wanted to build something for, the one who made success feel worthwhile. Without her, the company was just buildings and computers and business strategies, empty of the meaning she'd given it. The only thing that had kept Douglas going during those dark months was Rebecca, their daughter, their only child, the person they'd both loved more than anything in the world. Rebecca had been devastated by her mother's death, too. She and Catherine had been incredibly close, talking on the phone almost daily even after Rebecca had gotten married and moved into her own place. Watching Rebecca grieve had been almost as painful as his own grief, but it had also given Douglas purpose. He needed to be strong for her. He needed to help her through this loss. They only had each other now, and they needed to hold on to that, to support each other, to honor Catherine's memory by staying close. In the immediate aftermath of Catherine's death, that's exactly what had happened. Douglas and Rebecca had grown closer, united in their grief, supporting each other through the hardest period of both their lives. She'd started spending more time at the company, taking a more active role in operations. Douglas had been grateful for her involvement. Rebecca was smart and capable, with a business degree from Berkeley and an MBA from Harvard. She'd worked at several major corporations before joining Mitchell Innovations 5 years ago, and she'd proven herself competent and hard-working. When Douglas had promoted her to vice president of operations 2 years ago, it had been based purely on merit. She'd earned the position. After Catherine died, Douglas had started thinking more seriously about succession planning. He was 58 years old. He'd spent 35 years building this company, and he was tired. The grief had deepened that exhaustion, made him question what he was working for, why he was still putting in 70-hour weeks when the person he most wanted to share his success with was gone. He'd started thinking that maybe it was time to step back, to transition leadership to the next generation, to spend his remaining years doing something other than working. And who better to eventually lead Mitchell Innovations than his daughter, who shared his values, who understood what the company meant, who could carry on the legacy he and Catherine had built together. But over the past 18 months, something had changed. Douglas couldn't pinpoint exactly when it started, but gradually, increasingly, he'd begun to notice problems. Small things at first. Rebecca making decisions that seemed hasty or poorly thought out. Tensions developing between her and longtime employees who'd always gotten along with her before. Projects falling behind schedule or going over budget in her division. Rebecca becoming more stressed, more short-tempered, less like the daughter he knew. Douglas had tried to talk to her about it, gently at first, asking if she was okay, if she was overwhelmed, if she needed help or support. Rebecca had insisted everything was fine, had become defensive when he pressed, had accused him of micromanaging and not trusting her capabilities. Douglas had backed off, telling himself she was still grieving, that she needed space to process her mother's death in her own way, that he should give her time and support rather than criticism. But the problems hadn't improved. They'd gotten worse, much worse. Over the past 6 months, Rebecca's performance had deteriorated dramatically. She'd initiated a massive restructuring of the operations division that had resulted in the departure of 3 senior executives who'd been with the company for over 15 years. She'd pushed through changes to product development timelines that had angered the engineering team and resulted in the resignation of Mitchell Innovations' Chief Technology Officer, a brilliant woman who'd been instrumental to the company's success. She'd made decisions about client relationships that had cost them 2 major accounts worth tens of millions of dollars in annual revenue. The board of directors had started expressing concerns. Investors were asking questions. Employees were demoralized, worried about the company's direction, wondering what was happening to the organization they'd been proud to work for. And through it all, Rebecca seemed oblivious to the damage she was causing, or worse, dismissive of it. When Douglas tried to talk to her about specific problems, she became angry and defensive, accusing him of undermining her authority, of not supporting her, of treating her like a child instead of a capable executive. Their relationship, which had been so close in the immediate aftermath of Catherine's death, had become strained and tense. They barely spoke anymore outside of formal business meetings. When they did interact, conversations quickly devolved into arguments. Rebecca seemed like a different person from the daughter Douglas had known all her life, harder and colder and angrier, making decisions that went against everything he'd thought she believed in about how to treat people and run a business. Douglas had spent months trying to understand what was happening, trying to figure out where he'd gone wrong, how to help his daughter, how to save his company without destroying his relationship with his only child. He'd consulted with Philip Rodriguez, his attorney and friend of 30 years, who'd advised him that he had the authority as founder and majority shareholder to remove Rebecca from her position if necessary, but had cautioned that doing so would likely destroy their relationship permanently. He'd talked to Diane Foster, the most trusted member of his board, who'd expressed deep concerns about Rebecca's leadership, but had also noted that some of the problems might be coming from outside influences rather than Rebecca herself. That conversation with Diane had stuck with Douglas. Outside influences. She'd been carefully diplomatic in her wording, but Douglas had understood what she was suggesting. Rebecca's husband, Garrett Blackwood. Douglas had never particularly liked Garrett, though he'd tried to hide that dislike for Rebecca's sake. She'd met Garrett 4 years ago at an industry conference and had fallen hard and fast for him. They'd been married within 8 months, a whirlwind courtship that had worried Douglas and Catherine both, though they'd kept most of those concerns to themselves because Rebecca had seemed so happy. Garrett was 42 years old, 6 years older than Rebecca, and he was the CEO of Apex Solutions, a mid-sized technology company that competed in some of the same markets as Mitchell Innovations. He was handsome and charming and successful, at least on the surface. He said all the right things at family dinners. He treated Rebecca well in public. He seemed devoted to her. But there was something about him that had always made Douglas uneasy, something he couldn't quite articulate, a calculation behind the charm, a coldness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking, a way of subtly controlling conversations and situations that made Douglas feel manipulated even when he couldn't identify how it was happening. Catherine had felt it too. In one of their last private conversations before she'd gotten too sick to have such discussions, she'd told Douglas that she was worried about Rebecca's marriage, that something felt off about Garrett, that she wished Rebecca had waited longer before committing to someone she barely knew. But Catherine had never had the chance to explore those concerns further, and after her death, Douglas had been too consumed with grief and then too focused on work problems to pay much attention to Rebecca's personal life. Now, though, Diane's careful suggestion about outside influences had made Douglas start wondering. He'd started paying attention to the timeline of when problems had begun accelerating. It roughly coincided with around the time Catherine had died, and Rebecca's relationship with Garrett had deepened as she'd leaned on her husband for support through her grief. Douglas had started noticing things he'd missed before. How Garrett always seemed to be around when Rebecca was making controversial decisions. How some of the changes Rebecca was pushing for would actually benefit Apex Solutions at Mitchell Innovations' expense. How Rebecca seemed different, more stressed and unhappy whenever Garrett was present. 3 weeks ago, Douglas had made a decision that had shocked everyone who knew about it, including himself. He'd called an emergency board meeting and announced that he was stepping down as CEO, effective immediately. He was exhausted, he told the board. Catherine's death had taken more out of him than he'd realized, and he needed time away from the company to rest and grieve properly. He was appointing Rebecca as interim CEO while the board conducted a search for permanent leadership. He knew this was sudden, but he trusted Rebecca's capabilities, and he believed this was the right time for him to step back. The board had been stunned. Several members had tried to talk him out of it, arguing that this was too sudden, that Rebecca wasn't ready, that the company needed his steady leadership, especially during this period of turbulence. But Douglas had been adamant. His mind was made up. He was stepping down. The announcement had gone out to employees and investors the next day. Douglas Mitchell, founder and CEO of Mitchell Innovations, was retiring after 35 years. His daughter Rebecca would serve as interim CEO. What no one knew, what Douglas had confided only to Philip Rodriguez under attorney-client privilege, was that he had no intention of actually retiring. He had a different plan entirely, a plan so unusual and risky that Philip had tried for hours to talk him out of it. Douglas was going to go undercover in his own company. He was going to disappear from his public life, and he was going to come back as someone else. As a janitor, as a night shift maintenance worker who no executive would notice or pay attention to. And he was going to watch what happened at Mitchell Innovations when everyone thought he was gone. He was going to observe his daughter without the filter of their complicated relationship getting in the way. He was going to figure out what was really happening to his company and his child. And then he was going to fix it. The plan was insane. Philip had told him so repeatedly. It was dangerous, potentially illegal depending on how it was executed, definitely problematic from a corporate governance standpoint. If the board found out, they could sue him. If employees found out, it could destroy morale and trust. If Rebecca found out, it would end their relationship permanently. But Douglas couldn't think of any other way to get the truth. He needed to see what was really happening, needed to understand what had changed his daughter so dramatically, needed to know whether she was the problem or whether Diane was right about outside influences. So he'd done it. He'd announced his retirement 3 weeks ago. He'd made a show of cleaning out his office, saying emotional goodbyes to longtime colleagues, giving a speech about new chapters and spending time on himself. Then he'd disappeared from public view, and everyone assumed he was at his house in Napa Valley, resting and grieving and adjusting to retirement. Instead, Douglas had been busy with an elaborate transformation. He'd grown out his normally neat hair and beard, letting them become shaggy and unkempt. He'd stopped using the expensive products that had kept him looking younger than his age, letting the gray dominate completely. He'd bought cheap reading glasses that changed the shape of his face. He'd practiced hunching his shoulders, moving more slowly, carrying himself like a man who'd spent decades doing manual labor rather than sitting in boardrooms. He'd created a completely new identity, with a social security number obtained through legal but questionable means, employment records that would pass casual background checks, and references that would check out if anyone bothered to verify them, which no one would for a minimum-wage night janitor position. The identity was Dave Cooper, 59 years old, recently moved to San Francisco from Phoenix after his wife had died, and he decided he needed a fresh start in a new city. Dave had worked maintenance jobs his whole life, never made much money, never accomplished anything particularly notable. He was just a regular guy trying to make ends meet, grateful to have found a night shift janitorial position at a nice company like Mitchell Innovations. He was quiet, kept his head down, did his work, didn't bother anyone, completely invisible, exactly what Douglas needed to be. 2 weeks ago, Dave Cooper had started working the night shift as a janitor at Mitchell Innovations. The job had been surprisingly easy to get. Douglas, working through intermediaries, had made sure there was an opening in the janitorial contractor that serviced Mitchell Innovations' headquarters. Dave had applied, had a brief interview with a bored HR person who barely looked at his application, and was hired immediately. Night shift paid a little more because fewer people wanted to work those hours, but it still only came out to about $32,000 a year. Douglas had made more than that in a single day as CEO. Now he made it in a year, and he emptied trash cans and mopped floors and cleaned bathrooms in the building where he'd once commanded a billion-dollar empire. The irony wasn't lost on him. But neither was the effectiveness of the disguise. In 2 weeks of working at Mitchell Innovations, not a single person had recognized him. Executives he'd worked with for decades walked past him in hallways without a second glance. Security guards who'd greeted him by name every morning for years now barely acknowledged his existence except to check his ID badge. The invisibility of blue-collar workers in white-collar environments was remarkable and depressing. People saw the uniform, the mop, the trash cart, and they stopped seeing the person. It made Douglas's undercover mission possible, but it also made him profoundly uncomfortable about what that said about how society valued different types of work and workers. But personal discomfort aside, the plan was working. In just 2 weeks, Douglas had observed things he never would have seen as CEO. He worked the night shift, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., which meant he was in the building during hours when most employees were gone, but when certain people stayed late working. People like Rebecca, who'd been working 12 and 14-hour days since becoming interim CEO. People like certain executives who held meetings after hours that they apparently didn't want on official calendars. People like Garrett Blackwood, who wasn't even an employee of Mitchell Innovations, but who seemed to be in the building almost as much as Rebecca was. Douglas had been working as a janitor for 2 weeks, observing, learning, starting to piece together a picture of what was really happening at his company. And what he was discovering was simultaneously clarifying some of his concerns and raising new ones that were far more troubling than he'd anticipated. Tonight, as he stared at his reflection in the executive bathroom, having snuck up to the 47th floor before his shift officially started, Douglas was thinking about everything he'd learned so far and trying to decide what it meant and what he should do about it. The hardest part of this undercover operation wasn't the physical work, though that was challenging enough for a man who'd spent 3 decades sitting in boardrooms rather than pushing mop buckets. The hardest part was maintaining the disguise around his daughter. Seeing Rebecca every night, watching her struggle, observing her stress and exhaustion, and not being able to drop the act and talk to her as her father. Several times over the past 2 weeks, Douglas had almost blown his cover, almost approached Rebecca, and revealed himself because seeing her in such obvious distress was killing him. But he'd forced himself to maintain the disguise because what he was seeing was confirming his worst fears while also revealing details he hadn't suspected. Rebecca was clearly struggling as interim CEO. She looked exhausted, stressed to the breaking point, making decisions that seemed increasingly erratic. But Douglas was starting to understand that her struggles weren't coming from incompetence or malice. They were coming from manipulation. Specifically, manipulation by Garrett Blackwood, who was at the office almost every night, ostensibly supporting his wife, but actually, from what Douglas could observe, systematically undermining her confidence and judgment. Douglas had witnessed several late-night conversations between Rebecca and Garrett over the past 2 weeks. As a janitor, he was essentially invisible to them, able to empty trash cans and clean conference rooms while they talked, completely ignored as if he wasn't even there. What he'd heard in those conversations had made his blood run cold. Garrett's tone with Rebecca in private was nothing like the supportive husband act he performed in public. In private, he was critical and dismissive, constantly questioning her decisions, pointing out her mistakes, suggesting she was in over her head, undermining her confidence at every turn, but he did it all in a way that was subtle enough to be plausibly deniable. He never overtly insulted her. He just asked questions that implied incompetence, made suggestions that implied she couldn't handle the responsibility, offered to help in ways that made it clear he thought she was failing. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, the kind of emotional abuse that left no physical marks but could destroy someone's sense of self-worth just as effectively as any physical violence. And Douglas could see it working. Could see his confident, capable daughter becoming increasingly uncertain, increasingly dependent on Garrett's opinions, increasingly willing to make decisions that Garrett suggested even when those decisions went against her own judgment or the company's interests. It was heartbreaking to watch. It was also infuriating because Douglas was starting to understand that much of the damage Rebecca had done to Mitchell Innovations over the past 6 months hadn't been her idea at all. It had been Garrett's, filtered through Rebecca's authority and position. The picture that was emerging was of a calculated, long-term campaign of corporate sabotage disguised as a marriage. Garrett Blackwood had apparently married Douglas's daughter, not because he loved her, but because she was the heir to Mitchell Innovations. He'd spent years gaining her trust, isolating her from other relationships, positioning himself as her primary source of support and guidance. Then, when Catherine had died and Rebecca had been at her most vulnerable, Garrett had leveraged that vulnerability to increase his control and influence. Now, with Douglas supposedly retired and Rebecca in charge, Garrett was using his wife to systematically weaken Mitchell Innovations to the benefit of his own company, Apex Solutions. It was diabolical. It was also, Douglas was realizing, potentially criminal: corporate espionage, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty. If Douglas could prove what Garrett was doing, there were serious legal consequences. But proof was the challenge. What Douglas had observed so far was concerning but not conclusive. He needed more. He needed to document the manipulation, gather evidence, understand the full scope of what Garrett was doing. That's why he was continuing the undercover operation, why he was prepared to spend months, if necessary, working as a janitor in his own company. But tonight, something had changed. Tonight, Douglas had overheard a conversation that had shocked him even more than everything else he'd witnessed over the past 2 weeks. He'd been cleaning the executive floor conference room around 11 p.m., methodically emptying trash cans and wiping down surfaces when he'd heard raised voices from Rebecca's office down the hall. The office that used to be his office, that Rebecca had moved into when she'd become interim CEO. The door was closed, but the voices were loud enough to carry, especially in the empty nighttime silence of the executive floor. Douglas had frozen, listening, his hand still on the trash can he'd been emptying. He recognized both voices, Rebecca and Garrett. They were arguing, which wasn't unusual. Douglas had heard them argue several times over the past 2 weeks. But this argument was different, more heated, more intense. And what they were saying was making Douglas's stomach clench with a sick feeling that went beyond anger into genuine fear for his daughter's safety. He'd left the conference room, moving quietly down the hallway toward Rebecca's office, abandoning any pretense of working, focused entirely on what he was hearing. The rational part of his brain warned him that he was taking risks, that getting caught eavesdropping could blow his cover, but the father part of his brain didn't care. Something was very wrong, and he needed to know what was happening. Now, standing in the executive bathroom 20 minutes later, having heard enough of that conversation to understand just how bad the situation really was, Douglas stared at his reflection and faced a decision he'd hoped he wouldn't have to make yet. His plan had been to continue the undercover operation for several more weeks, maybe months, gathering comprehensive evidence of Garrett's manipulation and corporate sabotage before revealing himself and taking action. But what he'd heard tonight changed the timeline, changed everything, because Garrett Blackwood wasn't just manipulating Rebecca for corporate advantage. He was abusing her, emotionally, psychologically, and based on some of the things Douglas had heard tonight, possibly physically as well. Douglas's hands clenched into fists as he thought about the conversation he'd overheard. Garrett's voice raised in anger, calling Rebecca worthless and incompetent. Rebecca's voice, breaking, crying, apologizing for things that weren't her fault. The sound of something being thrown, Rebecca's startled cry, Garrett's cold response that she needed to stop being so dramatic. And then the worst part. The part that had made Douglas's vision go red with rage. Garrett telling Rebecca that if she really loved him, if she really wanted to save their marriage, she needed to sign the documents he'd prepared, transferring a significant portion of her Mitchell Innovations shares to his name. For tax purposes, he'd said, to protect their family assets, to show she trusted him. Douglas had wanted to burst into that office right then, had wanted to reveal himself, throw Garrett out physically if necessary, protect his daughter the way he should have been protecting her all along. But years of business experience and strategic thinking had overridden the immediate emotional impulse. Bursting in would solve the immediate crisis but wouldn't address the larger problem. Garrett would spin the situation, play the victim, potentially turn Rebecca against Douglas even more. What Douglas needed was a plan, evidence. A way to expose Garrett's abuse and manipulation that would make it impossible for Rebecca to deny or rationalize what was happening. So Douglas had forced himself to stay hidden, to maintain his disguise, to listen to that horrific conversation without intervening. It had been one of the hardest things he'd ever done, but he'd managed it, and now he was here in this bathroom, staring at his reflection, trying to figure out his next move. The conversation had eventually ended with Garrett leaving the building, though not before making several more cutting remarks about Rebecca's inadequacy. Douglas had waited in the bathroom, listening to Garrett's footsteps retreat down the hall, hearing the elevator ding as Garrett descended to the lobby. Then Douglas had carefully made his way back toward Rebecca's office, still in his janitor disguise, pushing his cleaning cart, just a night worker doing his job if anyone happened to see him. Rebecca's office door was still closed, but Douglas could see light under it. She was still in there, probably still at her desk, probably still crying, probably completely alone and thinking she had no one to turn to because her father had retired and her husband had just torn apart what was left of her self-esteem. The knowledge that his daughter was 30 feet away, in pain, needing help, and he was standing in a bathroom wearing a janitor's uniform, unable to comfort her, was almost unbearable. Douglas took a deep breath, forcing down the emotion, making himself think strategically. He pulled out his phone, the cheap prepaid device he'd bought for his Dave Cooper identity, and opened the Notes app. He'd been documenting everything he observed during his undercover operation, creating a detailed record of dates, times, conversations, and actions that could serve as evidence when the time came to reveal himself and take action. Now he added notes about tonight's conversation, trying to capture as much detail as he could remember while it was still fresh. As he typed, Douglas thought about the next steps. He needed more evidence, but he also needed to accelerate his timeline. He couldn't leave Rebecca in this situation any longer than absolutely necessary. What he'd heard tonight made it clear that Garrett's manipulation wasn't just about corporate sabotage anymore. If it ever had been only about that, this was about control, about breaking Rebecca down until she had no sense of self-worth left, until she was completely dependent on Garrett, until he could take everything she had, including her inheritance and her shares in the company her parents had built. Douglas made a decision. He'd continue the undercover work, but with a modified approach. He'd start being more proactive about documenting what was happening, maybe even finding ways to record conversations if he could do so legally. He'd reach out to Philip Rodriguez and bring him up to speed on everything he'd learned, get legal advice on the best way to handle both the corporate issues and the domestic abuse situation. He'd talk to Diane Foster on the board, prepare her for what was coming, make sure he had allies ready when it was time to take action, and he'd watch Rebecca more carefully, making sure she was safe, ready to blow his cover and intervene if Garrett's abuse escalated to the point where Douglas thought his daughter was in immediate danger. He'd hoped to avoid that, hoped to handle this in a way that would allow him to rebuild his relationship with Rebecca afterward. But if it came down to protecting her versus maintaining his cover, there was no question which choice he'd make. He was her father. Her safety came first. Always. Douglas finished his notes and put his phone away. He looked at himself in the mirror one more time, seeing both Douglas Mitchell and Dave Cooper, the CEO and the janitor, the father and the spy. He straightened his hunched shoulders for just a moment, letting himself stand at his full height, reminding himself who he really was under the disguise. Then he let his shoulders slump again, resumed his janitor posture, and headed back out to the executive floor to finish his shift. The next 6 months unfolded in a way that would have seemed impossible if Douglas hadn't been living through it himself. He continued working as Dave Cooper, night shift janitor, while simultaneously running one of the most elaborate undercover investigations he could have imagined. His life became a strange double existence, split between the invisible blue-collar worker mopping floors and the hidden CEO gathering evidence to save both his daughter and his company. The work was harder than Douglas had anticipated in every possible way. Physically, the janitorial job was demanding for a 58-year-old man who'd spent decades in executive positions. His back ached constantly from bending and lifting. His hands developed calluses from handling cleaning equipment and supplies. He lost weight despite eating more than usual, the physical labor burning calories faster than he could replace them. He went to bed exhausted every morning and woke up sore every afternoon, his body protesting the demands he was placing on it. But the emotional and psychological toll was far worse than any physical discomfort. Watching his daughter struggle night after night, seeing her confidence and spirit being systematically destroyed by the man who was supposed to love and support her, and not being able to intervene or even let her know he was there, was a special kind of torture. There were dozens of times when Douglas almost broke, almost revealed himself, almost dropped the disguise and tried to help her as her father rather than as an invisible janitor secretly documenting abuse. He forced himself to maintain the cover because what he was learning made it increasingly clear that a simple intervention wouldn't solve the problem. Garrett Blackwood's manipulation of Rebecca was part of a larger, more complex scheme that involved corporate espionage, financial fraud, and connections to organized crime that Douglas hadn't initially suspected. The more Douglas investigated, the more he realized that exposing Garrett would require careful documentation, legal preparation, and probably law enforcement involvement. A premature reveal could alert Garrett and give him time to cover his tracks or worse, escalate his abuse of Rebecca. So Douglas watched and documented and waited, even though every instinct screamed at him to act immediately. He observed Garrett systematically isolating Rebecca from her friends, her colleagues, anyone who might provide support or perspective that could counter his manipulation. He watched Garrett criticize every decision Rebecca made, undermining her confidence until she second-guessed even routine choices. He documented how Garrett pressured Rebecca to make business decisions that benefited Apex Solutions while harming Mitchell Innovations, always framing the pressure as support and guidance from a concerned husband. Most disturbingly, Douglas witnessed the escalation of Garrett's emotional abuse into something more overtly threatening. The cutting remarks became more frequent and more cruel. The gaslighting became more obvious, with Garrett denying things he'd said or done even when Douglas had documentation proving otherwise. There were incidents where Garrett would slam doors, throw objects near Rebecca, get physically close to her in ways that were clearly intended to intimidate. Douglas never witnessed Garrett actually strike Rebecca, but the threat of physical violence was implicit in his behavior. And Douglas could see his daughter becoming more afraid, more careful about what she said or did around her husband. The toll on Rebecca was visible and heartbreaking. Over the 6 months of Douglas's undercover operation, he watched his vibrant, confident daughter transform into a shadow of herself. She lost weight, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had always been athletic and healthy. Dark circles appeared under her eyes from stress and lack of sleep. Her hands developed a tremor that Douglas recognized from his own experience with anxiety. She started making mistakes at work that were completely out of character, not because she was incompetent, but because she was operating under enormous stress and undermined confidence. The company suffered alongside Rebecca. Mitchell Innovations. Performance continued to decline under her leadership, not because she was making bad decisions, but because she was making decisions that Garrett told her to make, decisions that served his interests rather than the company's. Revenue dropped. Key employees continued to leave. Clients expressed concerns. The board of directors became increasingly worried, with several members approaching Diane Foster privately to suggest that Rebecca needed to be removed from the interim CEO position. Diane, who was one of the few people who knew about Douglas's undercover operation, kept stalling the board, buying time for Douglas to complete his investigation. But even she was getting worried about how long this could continue without causing irreparable harm to both Rebecca and the company. She'd told Douglas in one of their secret meetings that he needed to wrap this up soon, that the board was losing patience, that she couldn't hold them off much longer without explaining why, which would mean revealing Douglas's secret operation and potentially compromising everything he'd worked for. Douglas understood the pressure, felt it himself, but he also knew he couldn't act until he had everything he needed. And what he needed was proof not just of Garrett's abuse and manipulation, but of the larger criminal conspiracy he'd uncovered. Because what Douglas had discovered over 6 months of investigation was that Garrett Blackwood wasn't just an abusive husband sabotaging his father-in-law's company for competitive advantage. He was part of a sophisticated corporate espionage operation involving multiple companies, offshore accounts, falsified documents, and connections to organized crime figures who specialized in financial fraud. Douglas had stumbled onto the larger conspiracy by accident 2 months into his undercover operation. He'd been cleaning a conference room late one night when he'd overheard Garrett on a phone call with someone discussing financial transactions that sounded questionable. Douglas had started paying more attention to Garrett's phone calls, noting names and details. He'd passed the information to Philip Rodriguez, who'd hired a private investigation firm to look into Garrett's background and business dealings. What they'd found was shocking. Apex Solutions, the company Garrett supposedly ran, was largely a front for money laundering and corporate espionage activities. Garrett himself had connections to several known organized crime figures who specialized in corporate fraud schemes. The marriage to Rebecca hadn't been a coincidence or even just an opportunistic targeting of a wealthy woman. It had been a calculated move in a larger operation designed to infiltrate and take control of Mitchell Innovations, using Rebecca as an unwitting asset. The plan, from what Douglas and the investigators could piece together, was for Garrett to systematically destroy Rebecca's credibility and mental health until she was willing to sign over significant portions of her Mitchell Innovations shares, ostensibly as part of their marriage assets, but actually to transfer control to the criminal organization Garrett worked for. Once they had majority control, they'd either strip the company's assets and bankrupt it, or use it as a vehicle for money laundering and other criminal activities. Rebecca was never meant to emerge from this marriage intact. She was a target, a victim, a means to an end for criminals who saw her not as a person, but as an access point to her father's wealth and company. The realization made Douglas physically sick. His daughter, his only child, the person he and Catherine had loved and protected and raised to be confident and strong, had been deliberately targeted by criminals who'd spent years gaining her trust and affection purely to exploit her for financial gain. The knowledge made Douglas's determination to expose Garrett absolute. This wasn't just about saving his company anymore. It was about protecting his daughter from predators who'd infiltrated their lives. It was about making sure Garrett and his criminal associates faced consequences for their actions. It was about rescuing Rebecca before the abuse and manipulation destroyed her completely. But building a case strong enough to accomplish all of that took time. Douglas had to gather evidence that would hold up not just in civil court, but potentially in criminal proceedings. He had to document the abuse, the corporate sabotage, the financial fraud, and the connections to organized crime in ways that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. He had to do all of this while maintaining his cover, protecting Rebecca from any retaliation, and preventing Garrett from realizing he was under investigation. The private investigators Philip had hired were excellent, but their work took months. They had to trace offshore accounts, document financial transactions, establish connections between Garrett and known criminals, gather evidence of fraud and money laundering. Meanwhile, Douglas continued his undercover work, documenting Garrett's abuse and manipulation, recording conversations when legally possible, building a parallel case about domestic abuse and corporate sabotage. It was during month 4 of the operation that Douglas made a connection that proved crucial to ultimately taking Garrett down. He'd been cleaning late one night when he'd encountered Yuki Tanaka, a 27-year-old woman who worked as an executive assistant in the operations division. Yuki worked late frequently, and Douglas had noticed her over several months. She was smart, observant, and notably one of the few people in the building who actually acknowledged his existence as Dave the janitor, always greeting him politely and sometimes making small talk during her late-night coffee breaks. One night, Yuki had been particularly upset, almost in tears as she worked at her desk. Douglas, in his Dave persona, had asked if she was okay. Yuki had hesitated, clearly debating whether to confide in a janitor, but eventually, the stress had overwhelmed her discretion. She'd told Douglas that she was worried about Rebecca, that something seemed very wrong, that Rebecca's husband Garrett made her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Douglas, still maintaining his janitor cover, had encouraged her to talk. Yuki had explained that she'd worked closely with Rebecca for 3 years and had always respected her as a boss and admired her capabilities. But over the past year, especially since Rebecca had become interim CEO, Yuki had watched her deteriorate. She'd witnessed some of Garrett's interactions with Rebecca and had recognized them as emotionally abusive, having experienced a similar relationship herself years ago. She'd wanted to help, to say something, but she didn't know how to approach a situation involving her boss and her boss's husband. That conversation had given Douglas an idea. Over the following weeks, he'd carefully cultivated a friendship with Yuki, still as Dave the janitor, positioning himself as a sympathetic listener and eventually revealing just enough of his concerns about Rebecca to establish common ground. Yuki had proven to be an invaluable ally. As an executive assistant with access to operations division files and communications, she'd been able to provide Douglas with information and documentation he couldn't access as a janitor. More importantly, Yuki had been willing to testify about what she'd witnessed of Garrett's treatment of Rebecca. Her observations, from someone who'd had regular professional contact with Rebecca, would be valuable corroboration for Douglas's own documentation of the abuse. Yuki had also noticed things Douglas hadn't, patterns of behavior and incidents that filled in gaps in his understanding of how Garrett's manipulation had progressed. By month 5, Douglas had accumulated a substantial amount of evidence. Documentation of Garrett's abuse spanning 6 months. Financial records showing suspicious transactions between Apex Solutions and offshore accounts. Communications linking Garrett to known criminals. Witness statements from Yuki and several other employees who'd noticed concerning behavior. Expert analysis from the private investigators detailing the larger criminal conspiracy. Legal opinions from Philip about the various civil and criminal charges that could potentially be pursued. But even with all that evidence, Douglas hesitated to reveal himself and take action. He was acutely aware that he'd only have one chance to do this right. If he moved too soon, if his evidence wasn't quite solid enough, Garrett could escape consequences through legal technicalities or could retaliate against Rebecca before protective measures could be put in place. If Douglas waited too long, Rebecca might reach a breaking point or might sign away her shares before he could intervene. The decision of when to act was taken out of Douglas's hands in month 6, when Garrett's behavior escalated to a point that made continued waiting impossible. Douglas had been cleaning the executive floor late one night when he'd heard shouting from Rebecca's office, louder and more violent than anything he'd heard before. He'd immediately moved toward the office, abandoning any pretense of janitorial work, his only thought to get to his daughter and make sure she was safe. What he'd witnessed through the partially open office door had made his blood run cold. Garrett had Rebecca backed into a corner, his hand raised, clearly on the verge of striking her. Rebecca was crying, cowering, one hand raised protectively in front of her face. Garrett was screaming about incompetence and failure, his face twisted with rage that looked barely controlled. Douglas had moved without thinking, bursting into the office, his janitor disguise forgotten in the overwhelming need to protect his child. He'd put himself physically between Garrett and Rebecca, not caring anymore about cover or strategy or evidence, thinking only that he would not let this man hurt his daughter. Garrett had turned his rage on this nobody janitor who dared to interfere, raising his hand to strike Douglas instead. That had been Garrett's mistake. Because Douglas might have been 58 years old and disguised as a janitor, but he was still 6 feet 2 inches tall, had stayed in decent shape despite months of stressful undercover work, and was motivated by 6 months of rage at what this man had done to his daughter. When Garrett had swung at him, Douglas had blocked the hit and responded with a punch that had sent Garrett staggering backward. There had been a brief physical altercation that had ended with Garrett on the floor and Douglas standing over him, breathing hard, his janitor persona completely shattered. Rebecca had been staring at him in shock and confusion, clearly not understanding what was happening, not recognizing the janitor who'd just protected her. Douglas had turned to her, had seen the fear and pain in her eyes, and had made a split-second decision. He'd pulled off the reading glasses that had been part of his disguise, had straightened to his full height, had let his voice drop from Dave Cooper's careful accent to his own natural tone. "Rebecca," he'd said. "It's me. It's Dad." The recognition on Rebecca's face had been immediate and devastating. Shock, confusion, disbelief, all flashing across her features in rapid succession. "Dad?" she'd whispered, her voice breaking. "What? How? I don't understand." "Why are you dressed like that? Why are you here? What's happening?" Douglas had wanted nothing more than to gather his daughter in his arms and comfort her, but there was no time. Garrett was already struggling to his feet, his face contorted with rage and what Douglas recognized as panic. He knew his cover was blown, knew that whatever he'd been planning was falling apart. Douglas had seen him reach for his phone, clearly intending to call someone, probably his criminal associates. Douglas had moved fast, knocking the phone from Garrett's hand and using his own phone to call security, and then Philip Rodriguez. The next several hours had been chaotic. Security had arrived and detained Garrett. Philip had shown up with police officers he'd briefed in advance about Douglas's investigation. Douglas had produced his documentation, and the police had arrested Garrett on multiple charges including domestic violence, corporate espionage, fraud, and various other crimes that the private investigators had uncovered. Garrett had been handcuffed and removed from the building, shouting threats and accusations the entire time. Through all of that chaos, Rebecca had sat in her office chair, looking shell-shocked and devastated, trying to process what was happening. Her father, who she'd thought had retired 6 months ago, had apparently been working as a janitor in their building that whole time. Her husband, who she'd loved and trusted, had just been arrested for crimes she didn't fully understand. Everything she'd thought she knew about her life had been revealed as a lie, and she was struggling to comprehend any of it. Once Garrett had been taken away, and the immediate crisis was over, Douglas had finally been able to sit down with Rebecca and begin explaining. It had been one of the hardest conversations of his life. He'd had to tell his daughter that he'd been watching her for 6 months without revealing himself, that he'd documented her husband's abuse without intervening until the absolute last moment, that her entire marriage had been a lie, that Garrett had never loved her, that she'd been targeted and manipulated by criminals who'd seen her only as a means to access her father's company. Rebecca had cycled through shock, disbelief, anger, grief, and back to shock as Douglas had carefully laid out everything he'd learned. She'd been angry at Douglas for deceiving her, for watching her suffer without helping, for not trusting her enough to just tell her what he suspected. She'd been devastated about Garrett, about realizing that the man she'd loved and trusted had never been who she thought he was. She'd been humiliated about how she'd been manipulated, how she'd made decisions that had harmed the company because she'd believed Garrett's advice. She'd felt every complicated emotion imaginable, and Douglas had sat with her through all of it, letting her process, answering her questions, apologizing for the ways his choices had hurt her, even as he explained why he'd made those choices. It had taken hours, but eventually the initial shock had faded enough for Rebecca to start thinking more clearly. She'd had questions about the evidence, about what Douglas had learned, about what would happen next. Douglas had been honest with her about everything. About the criminal conspiracy Garrett had been part of, about the extent of the manipulation and abuse, about the charges Garrett was facing and the evidence that supported those charges, about the damage that had been done to Mitchell Innovations and the work that would be needed to repair it. And then Rebecca had asked the question that Douglas had been dreading. "Did Mom know?" she'd asked quietly. And before she died, did she know something was wrong with Garrett? Douglas had considered lying, considered sparing Rebecca that additional pain, but he'd decided she deserved the truth. "Yes," he'd said gently. "Your mother had concerns about him. She told me toward the end that something felt off about your relationship with Garrett, that she wished you'd waited longer before marrying him, but she never had specific evidence, just instinct. And then she got too sick to pursue those concerns further." Rebecca had started crying again at that, grieving not just for the betrayal she'd experienced, but for her mother's wisdom that she'd ignored. Douglas had held her then, finally able to offer the comfort and support he'd wanted to provide for 6 months. They'd sat together in that office for a long time, father and daughter, trying to process the devastation of the past year and figure out how to move forward. The aftermath of that night had been complicated and difficult. The immediate priority had been ensuring Rebecca's safety and getting her the support she needed. Douglas had arranged for Rebecca to stay with him at his house in Napa for a few weeks, giving her space away from the apartment she'd shared with Garrett. He'd connected her with a therapist who specialized in domestic abuse and psychological manipulation. He'd helped her file for divorce and obtain a restraining order against Garrett. Meanwhile, the legal and criminal proceedings against Garrett had moved forward. The evidence Douglas and the private investigators had gathered was compelling enough that Garrett had eventually accepted a plea deal rather than face trial. He'd pled guilty to corporate espionage, fraud, domestic violence, and several other charges. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison and ordered to pay millions in restitution. Several of his criminal associates were also arrested and charged based on the evidence the investigation had uncovered. For Mitchell Innovations, the recovery had been slower but ultimately successful. Douglas had come out of his fake retirement and resumed his role as CEO, with the board's grateful support. Rebecca had stepped down from her interim CEO position, choosing to take an extended leave of absence to focus on her mental health and recovery from the abuse. The company had implemented new security measures to prevent future corporate espionage. They'd launched an internal investigation to identify and undo the damage Garrett had caused through Rebecca's manipulated decisions. It had taken nearly a year for Mitchell Innovations to fully stabilize. Several major clients who'd left during the turbulent period had to be won back through careful relationship rebuilding. Key employees who'd resigned had to be replaced with new talent. The company's reputation, which had suffered during the months of poor leadership, had to be restored through consistent performance and transparent communication. But eventually, Mitchell Innovations had recovered. Revenue had returned to previous levels and then exceeded them. Employee morale had improved. The board had regained confidence in the company's direction. Douglas's relationship with Rebecca had been harder to repair than the company's performance. Rebecca had struggled for a long time with conflicting feelings about what had happened. She understood intellectually why Douglas had chosen to investigate undercover rather than confronting her directly about his concerns. She recognized that a direct confrontation likely would have driven her deeper into Garrett's manipulation and made her defensive rather than receptive. But emotionally, she struggled with feelings of betrayal that her father had watched her suffer for 6 months without revealing himself, had documented her worst moments, had seen her at her lowest points without offering support. They'd worked through those feelings slowly, with the help of family therapy sessions that Douglas had suggested, and Rebecca had eventually agreed to attend. Over time, Rebecca had come to understand that Douglas's choices, however painful they'd been for both of them, had ultimately saved her from a situation that would have destroyed her completely if it had continued. She'd come to appreciate that gathering comprehensive evidence had been necessary to ensure Garrett faced real consequences and couldn't manipulate his way out of accountability. For his part, Douglas had learned difficult lessons about the limits of protection and the importance of open communication. He'd apologized to Rebecca for not trusting her enough to share his concerns before resorting to undercover investigation. He'd acknowledged that his approach, while ultimately necessary, had caused her additional pain and had damaged their relationship in ways that had taken time to heal. He'd committed to being more open with her going forward, to trusting her strength and judgment, to remembering that she was a capable adult rather than a child who needed protection at any cost. Slowly, painfully, they'd rebuilt their relationship. It hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks and difficult conversations and moments when it seemed like the damage might be permanent, but they'd kept working at it, kept showing up for therapy and for each other, kept choosing to move forward rather than remaining stuck in past hurts. And eventually, they'd found their way back to something resembling the close relationship they'd had before Catherine's death, and Garrett's manipulation had complicated everything. 2 years after the night Douglas had revealed himself and Garrett had been arrested, Rebecca had returned to Mitchell Innovations. She'd spent the intervening time in therapy, in recovery, rebuilding her confidence and sense of self-worth that Garrett's abuse had damaged so severely. She'd also spent time learning, taking courses in psychology and organizational behavior to better understand how manipulation worked and how to recognize warning signs. She'd become an advocate for domestic violence survivors, speaking publicly about her experience and working with organizations that supported people leaving abusive relationships. When she'd come back to Mitchell Innovations, it had been in a different role than before. She'd asked not to return to operations or to be considered for CEO succession, at least not for the foreseeable future. Instead, she'd taken a position heading up a new corporate ethics and security division, using her experience to help Mitchell Innovations and other companies identify and prevent the kinds of infiltration and manipulation that Garrett had perpetrated. It was work that gave her purpose and allowed her to turn her painful experience into something meaningful. Douglas had been proud of his daughter's resilience and her commitment to turning trauma into positive action. He'd supported her new direction without reservation, understanding that she needed to chart her own path forward, rather than simply resuming the trajectory she'd been on before Garrett had entered her life. He'd also been relieved that the pressure of CEO succession was no longer hanging over their relationship. Rebecca might eventually choose to pursue leadership roles again, but it would be her choice, in her own time, based on her own desires rather than obligation or expectation. Now, standing in the same executive bathroom where he'd made the decision to go undercover 2.5 years ago, Douglas looked at his reflection and saw changes that went beyond the physical. He was 61 now, officially planning to retire for real within the next year or two. His hair was completely gray, his face more lined than it had been when he'd started this whole ordeal, but there was also something different in his eyes. A wisdom born of difficult experience, an understanding of complexity and cost that hadn't been there before. He'd saved his daughter. He'd exposed a criminal conspiracy. He'd protected his company. Those were victories worth celebrating. But he'd also learned that protection sometimes required difficult choices, that love sometimes meant watching someone struggle rather than immediately rescuing them. That relationships required trust and honesty even when fear and circumstances made honesty seem impossible. Those were lessons he wished he hadn't needed to learn, but that had ultimately made him a better father and a better person. Douglas straightened his tie, the expensive silk a stark contrast to the janitor's uniform he'd worn for 6 months. He was about to head down to a board meeting where they'd be finalizing his actual retirement plans and discussing Rebecca's future role in the company. It would be a good meeting, he thought, a healing meeting, a meeting that looked forward rather than backward. But before he left the bathroom, he took one last moment to think about Dave Cooper, the janitor identity he'd created and inhabited, the disguise that had allowed him to see truths he'd been blind to as a CEO. Dave Cooper hadn't been real. but the invisibility he'd experienced had been very real. The lesson about how society valued different types of work and workers had been very real. The understanding of how power and position could blind someone to what was happening right in front of them had been very real. Douglas carried those lessons with him now, incorporated them into how he thought about business and leadership and humanity. Dave Cooper was gone, but what Douglas had learned while being him remained a permanent part of who he was now. What did you think of Douglas's incredible journey? From CEO to janitor, from father to undercover investigator, from watching his daughter suffer to finally saving her from a nightmare marriage that nearly destroyed her. Douglas's story shows us that love sometimes requires difficult choices, that protection isn't always about immediate rescue, and that the people closest to us can be suffering in ways we never see unless we're willing to look from a different perspective. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. How would you have handled discovering your child was being abused and manipulated? Do you think Douglas made the right choice going undercover instead of confronting Rebecca directly? And what would you have done in Rebecca's position when you learned the truth? Share your story. Your experience might help someone else who's dealing with family members in abusive relationships or facing impossible choices about how to protect the people they love. Now, rate this story from 0 to 10. Let me know what you thought. Was it the powerful journey of father-daughter redemption you were hoping for? And if you believe that family is worth fighting for, that abusers should be exposed no matter how long it takes, and that love sometimes means making choices that hurt in the short term to help in the long term, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have more incredible true stories coming your way every week. Thank you so much for watching Douglas and Rebecca's story. Remember, if you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse or manipulation, there is help available. You are not alone. You are not to blame, and you deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. The abuse is not your fault, and there are people and resources ready to support you when you're ready to seek help. Until next time, this is Deep Stories, where every story reminds us that courage comes in many forms, that protection sometimes requires sacrifice, and that family bonds can survive even the most devastating betrayals when both people are committed to healing. See you in the next one.